why do you put books and recommendations for books on your website?
Well, look, I used to be an academic. Books have always been a big part of my life, and it was actually a pretty smart communications director's idea, because she said, you know, we get these questions all the time. What do you read? What are you doing? Because I talk about them. I use books when I'm making a point in a town hall meeting. So we decided we would just turn it into a regular feature, and been pretty surprised about how much attention it gets.
And you change it every month or so.
Yeah, we do. We've sort of struggled to find the right way. Sometimes it'll be a series of books on a particular topic. For Native Americans, we did that one time. But it's usually the easiest way is literally, what are you reading now? And we keep one up about a month, and maybe I'll have 2 or 3 books that I'm reading, and we'll just, okay, here, take the picture, and this month, next month, whatever.
Do you ever post reviews?
No, never have done too much of that. Just don't have a lot of time to write reviews.
But
if I put the book up there, it means I think it was a pretty good book.
What are you reading right now?
You know, I thought I would take a little break, and I'm reading, and this is one of those classic cases where you see the movie, so you want to read the book, The Martian, by, what was that, Weir? I think Andy Weir. And then I got intrigued by this new Netflix thing, The Man in the High Castle, which is an old book, 62 Hugo Award winner. I used to read science fiction when I was a kid, and for whatever reason, I didn't read that one. And a guy named Philip Dick, who's now dead. But so those are kind of the light things. Just finished up a biography of Roger Cherneau's wonderful one on Washington, which is a fabulous book, but boy, it's long.
You read mostly nonfiction, right?
I do. It's mostly heavy biography, history. I used to be an historian, so that's what I enjoy. But you know, we'll have some things like, you know, every now and then. And if I read fiction, it's quite often. It's not this case. This is like I'm going back to being 12. I mean, 2 science fiction books basically. But I read quite a bit of historical fiction. I love Kathleen McCullough's wonderful series on Julius Caesar, First Man of Rome, or things like that. But mostly heavy history, heavy biography.
Now, you mentioned that you're an academician, but you've also got your PhD. Where did you teach?
I actually taught as a graduate assistant and as an adjunct professor at University of Oklahoma, Oklahoma Baptist University, and that was just a semester gig. Taught in Grinnell College's London program. That was a fun one. I have my undergraduate degree from there. And then, you know, I've done an odd stint, you know, teaching a class. I taught with Don Fowler, former Democratic National Committee Chairman. He and I taught, before I was in Congress, a class in national parties and campaigns at GW up here in D.C., and I taught a campaign course years ago at the University of Central Oklahoma.
Are there any historians that, when they come out with a book or whose entire series you've read?
Look, I love anything that Stephen Ambrose wrote. He was really, and a lot of range in his writing. I mean, you very good. Obviously, John McCullough is excellent historian. But you know, probably in an earlier period, I mean, it was very heavily focused on British history, and you know, these were not all you know, histories, but boy, Churchill was always worth reading. You know, whether it's his memoirs, whether it's his, he had a wonderful little book called Great Contemporaries, written back in the 20s, which later on Nixon actually did a sort of follow-on kind of book himself. I like to read Richard Nixon stuff. I like to read about Richard Nixon. I think he's the most fascinating politician of my lifetime. And I thought the things that he wrote were really quite good.
Does your reading help you in your work as a congressman?
It does. You know, history in particular provides a lot of context, a lot of analogies, frankly, a lot of just understanding. I mean, because most people, when they get to Congress, if they're not careful, they sort of think history begins with them. You know, that there's something, but you're really stepping into the flow of something, an institution, or, you know, and if you read particularly contemporary history, you know, a lot of interesting not only parallels but background, quite frankly, to what's going on. You know, you want to understand Congress. John Barry wrote a wonderful book years ago called The Ambition and the Power, which Barry is a really substantive writer that he did like, what was it? Oh gosh, the great book on 1927 flood in Mississippi. I think it was Rising Tide or something. But he got hooked up with Speaker Wright before he realized, or they either one, he was in his last year basically, and he was just going to write a book about Congress, and it turned into the rise and fall of Speaker Wright, and there's a lot of characters in there. And in that case, a lot of people I know. Newt Gingrich is in there, Mickey Edwards, who I'd worked for many years ago, guys like Wes Watkins, little vignettes, or more consequential figures in the sense that they were close to Wright. That you read about. So those kind of things I think are extraordinarily helpful, and sometimes particularly when older members or more senior members are telling stories, you know something about the context of that the story really comes out of. One of the things I love Hal Rogers. Hal's been here since the chairman of appropriations. My chairman has been here since 1980. When he starts telling you stories about the guys that when he got here had been here since the 50s, it's fabulous.
Besides John Barry's book, are there other books that you would recommend about Congress or that you read before you took your seat? One of the more interesting books, it's not about Congress per se, it's a biography, but Lynn Cheney's recent biography of Madison is a good book, because here's a guy that in many ways shaped the system, so both in terms of the Constitution and then serving in the body in its very first term. So I think he's always worth reading about. I like these things. Again, Nixon is good. I'm trying to remember the Johnson series. Robert Caro?
Yeah, those are spectacular. They really, because nobody knew this institution, the Senate, the presidency, obviously, just the breadth of American politics like he did. Although, Nixon in a very different kind of way, and I had the opportunity to meet him on several occasions, really knew this. I would also say the biography of Gerald Ford, obviously, because he really, even though he was a president, very much a creature of the House. I think it was, not Lou Cannon, maybe Joe Cannon, I can't remember. But
I think you're right with Lou Cannon.
Yeah, maybe then. But great, I think it was Time and Chance or something like that. But it's a wonderful book, and again, you're lost in the politics of the era, because this guy comes in the 40s, is minority leader when he's elevated to vice presidency. That's an awful lot of history. So, years ago I worked for a guy that not enough people remember. They should. Guy Vanderjack, who was really the creator of the modern political campaign committee over at the NRCC. He arrived in 1966. And lost the Republican primary in '92. But you talk about a guy that understood the institution, because he was involved in campaigns all across the country, was a very consequential legislator, delivered the nomination speech for Ronald Reagan at the '80 convention. Pretty cool guy, and his ability to tell stories and Constitution, his observations, even though I used to call him Moses, because he got us right to the edge of the promised land. And had he not lost his '92 primary, he would have been reelected as NRCC chairman and would have had the opportunity to be here at the creation of the modern Republican majority. He probably did more to bring it on than any single guy. So, but you pick up some of it listening to members, and some of it reading. So
when you read some of these older biographies about Lyndon Johnson or Gerald Ford, do you ever say to yourself, the House doesn't work that way anymore? Or,
yeah, occasionally you do. I mean, obviously the House changes with the times, although there are lots of elements that are the same. I like to think, honestly, the Appropriations Committee is a little island that actually pretty much functions the way it was supposed to. Now, that wasn't always true. It went through a rough time. But Rogers, who very much, in the best sense, institutionalist and a creature of the House, so to speak, has really done a lot, I think, to restore that in the hopes that it can spread more broadly across Congress. But there's no question we live in a very divided, very ideological time, and where the ability to arrive at consensus or make a deal or literally, I have a lot of good friends on the other side, but there's not as many issues that you can work on together in the way that clearly some of our predecessors managed to do.
Given your Oklahoma roots, do you ever read books on Andrew Jackson? And
my grandmother wouldn't carry. We are Chickasaw, and so my great-great-grandfather was forcibly removed from Mississippi, and was some of the last Chickasaws to come out. So we were raised with as I used to tell people, when I was 5 years old, I wasn't sure who Andrew Jackson was, but I knew he was a very bad man who had done evil things. So my grandmother literally wouldn't carry a $20 bill, and so. I've read, I remember when Robert Remini was the historian of the House, who's also written a wonderful book on Congress. I should have mentioned him. But Roy Blunt, who has he's a big reader. You should talk to Roy sometime. Roy, one time, he invites me up when he's chief whip and Rodney Frelinghuysen to have lunch with Dr. Remini, and he presents me with a copy of Jackson's Indian Wars, and he presents Rodney with a copy of the Henry Clay biography, because Rodney, I think it was his great-grandfather, Theodore, actually ran on the ticket with Henry Clay. Actually also held the floor against Indian removal for 3 days. So we were both sort of Jackson enemies, by descent. But it was a wonderful lunch, and I remember Remini handing me the book, and he's saying, now, you probably won't agree with my thesis in this book, but I want you to read it and think about it and come back. And the argument was basically, not that he meant to do it, but that, in some ways, the removal of the five great tribes of the Southeast, Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creek, Seminole, saved them because it pushed them further out and kept them from being totally overrun. That's a unique explanation for violating treaty rights and what was effectively ethnic cleansing of the southeast part of the country. So, as I told, I don't agree with you in some ways, but I will say this. I remember having gone, in the same time frame I'd read this, we have a great Chickasaw festival in Tishomingo, Oklahoma, which is the site of the old Chickasaw capital. I had a great-grandfather who was the treasurer of the Chickasaw Nation. And there's thousands of Chickasaws that come to this thing. And it is amazing. That might not have been the case. We might not have survived in quite the same way we did, and because we're a large tribe, we're a 60,000 person tribe, and you don't have anything anywhere near that size on the East Coast, and the areas where you obviously had European and then American conflict and contact.
What about books on Native American history?
Oh gosh, a lot of them. Charles Mann's book is where you ought to start. It's not really so much Native American, but it's 1491, which is what's the state of the indigenous population in North and South America on the eve of European arrival, and what had happened, and how devastating that contact was, and everything. Mann makes the case that the disease alone was much, much greater in terms of the number of people, and the Indians, whether in North or South America, always had contact in a sense with whites long before they saw them, because disease traveled ahead. and decimated a lot of these populations. So that's a good one. I love Empire of the Summer Moon. The Comanche Nation is in my district, and it's a great biography on Quanah Parker by S.L. Glynn. It was a near award winner. It's just one of the best biographies. A guy named Ariel Gibson wrote a wonderful, now dated history of my own tribe, the Chickasaws. Again, there's a lot of them. It's a biography of my great aunt, Teata, very wonderful Indian folklore artist and storyteller, lived to almost 100, did the first entertainment in the Roosevelt White House for Ramsay MacDonald in March of 33, and then entertained the King and Queen of England at Hyde Park in 39, performed all over the world, so I got to get a plug in for her. But there's, again, lots of them, lots of great books. Angie DeBow, one of the great historians of Native America. A lot of people will be familiar with her biography of Geronimo, but some ways her most consequential book's a book called "And Still the Waters Flow," and it's about what happened to the 5 tribes when Oklahoma was opened up to white settlement, and the Dawes Commission, the allotment process was unrolled. My family owns the last of our allotment land still, but a pretty devastating experience for the tribes that had already been removed and effectively had their every treaty broken, their land allotted up into individual ownership, which in many cases were then systematically looted from them. It's a really tragic tale, and so it's not as if every bad thing that happened to Indians happened 200 years ago. Or this is early 20th century in Oklahoma. So still it's a difficult history. It's difficult for Americans, I think, sometime to get their hands around because honestly, it doesn't reflect very well on either the American government or, frankly, the American, treatment of Native Americans by the non-native population. It's a hard history.
Congressman Cole, do you ever bring authors in to speak to the Republican conference, or do you ever recommend books to your?
Well, I recommend books all the time. As a matter of fact, every Christmas I have a dinner for my Republican appropriators and my classmates. We threw in the Republican appropriators because the classmates are always a diminishing group, obviously, as they retire. I'm going to lose 3 of my great good friends this year. But we always buy a present, and it's almost always a book. So I gave them all I think the most popular one was probably Unbroken, which everybody loves that book. And
Laura. Hillenbrand.
Yeah.
Laura Hillenbrand.
Yeah. He's a great author of Seabiscuit. Yeah. It's a fabulous book. One year I gave him Bob Woodward's book, The Price of Politics, is a great book. And I think particularly when I gave it, I think I gave it out in 2012, and it's all on the budget crisis and the Budget Act of 2011. So you guys need to read this because all the characters are still the same. And they're all here, and it'll help us understand what
Did you
doing.
find that book accurate when it talked about President Obama and your friend
I'll
John
tell you a
Boehner
funny story.
interaction?
We were getting, parts of it I knew. I think it's very accurate. Look, he's one of the great reporters, but he was kind enough to agree to sign all of them. So we bought about 50 or 60, and the person who was putting on the dinner took him my copy to be signed as he was doing all the others. And he opens it up, and when I read, I write. And so it's underlining and it's this or that. And he starts going through there, and he looks at her and says, "Does BS mean what I think it means?" And she goes, and so he literally sat there for something close to an hour. She told me the story. And read the comments on
You had
the
put
book.
BS in the
Yeah,
paper?
well, I can't remember what the story. It may have been aimed at the character as opposed to the account, because I do think, I don't want to be critical. Look, I've had I have a wonderful relationship with John Boehner, but it's up and down relationship. Well, I should say up, down, and up. So we're in a good place now. And I have a decent relationship with the president on a personal basis. I've had the opportunity to interact with him. He was wonderful, frankly, in my hometown. In the Moore tornadoes in 2013, we couldn't have asked for a more compassionate response. If you look around this office, I always joke, I'm probably the only Republican that has 5 pictures of Barack Obama in his office, because we've done everything. He's good on Indian things, and so most Indian legislation tends to be bipartisan. We've worked well with the White House on everything from the Cobell settlement, which is the largest class action settlement in American history for mismanagement of Indian trust land. Violence Against Women Act had a very important tribal provision to expand tribal. The Tribal Law and Order Act, Indian reservations are under-resourced in terms of police, and there's all sorts of tricky jurisdictional questions to try and work with those. So, but having said that, I like both these guys. I mean, I think some of the president's observations about John Boehner really based on misunderstanding who John Boehner was, and you can see in that book there's actually a part where he talks. Well, I understand guys like Boehner. He's a country club Republican. Now, I will grant you that Boehner looks like a country club Republican, and he plays a lot of golf at country clubs, but he's anything but a country club Republican. This is a guy that grew up in a family of 12. He's the only one that got to college. His dad ran a bar. I think he took longer to get through college because he was doing a business. I mean, he's a much different guy, and his story, in some ways, to the rise to the speakership is every bit as remarkable given his circumstances and where he started in life as the president's is, which is a great American story. I think sometimes it would have helped if that book had been written before and they could have each read the book. I think we might have had a somewhat different ending to the story, although, frankly, they maintained a reasonably good relationship despite the difficulties of the era. So anyway, back to the main point. I mean, obviously we give books every year to these things, and it's always interesting to see what your colleagues, the ones that read them, not if you don't have a lot of time to read, but Unbroken was popular. Empire of the Summer Moon, I love that one. I did one recently, and I'm blanking on the author's name. Devotion. It's a fabulous, fabulous book about 2 American pilots. One of them, the first African American carrier pilot, and his wingmate, who was Annapolis, Ivy League educated, I think, but from a very affluent family in Connecticut, still alive. The African Americans shot down over Korea in these joint missions where they were frankly helping cover the retreat from the Yalu River, but how close they were, and the white pilot, and all the pilots are trying to cover this guy who's had to crash land his plane. He can't get out of the plane. He's trapped in. Eventually dies in the plane, sadly. His name was Jesse Brown. But the white pilot crash lands his plane to try and get his friend out of the plane. And it's everything from the letter that the African American pilot writes to his wife the night before he's killed. It's just, and it's all reproduced in there, photostat in there of the handwritten letter. Guy had wonderfully clear penmanship. But stuff like that, I mean, that's pretty priceless stuff.
Adam Makos.
Yes. Thank you for remembering. But I should be embarrassed to have forgotten. I thought it was one of the best books. Said so many great things about the country. In a difficult time, we still had Jim Crow. It's way pre-civil rights, and yet here's 2 guys and the crew around them on the aircraft carrier that they all became friends, and it's a very moving, very patriotic story. It's like Unbroken. It ought to be a movie, and I hope someday it is.
Do you read a book a week?
It'll vary. Obviously, it depends on how long the books are. So yeah, on average, probably 1 a week, something like that. Certainly 2 or 3 a month. So.
Do you have on the airplane back and forth to Oklahoma?
Absolutely, yeah. I do I do 2 things on the airplane. If I'm fortunate enough to get upgraded, then I keep a journal, and so that's, if I'm several days behind, that's a good stretch of time to catch up. But usually reading, yeah.
Is that journal for a future book?
I don't know. a good friend of mine who's since deceased was a wonderful historian named Rufus Fears. And Rufus, if you ever go to people that read or listen to Teaching Company, which has these wonderful lectures, he's got like 5 different series in there. And he was a classical historian, so I mean there's lives of famous Greeks and Romans. But at the University of Oklahoma, he held a chair funded by the Blankenship family on freedom, and he wrote gave a great lecture series called The History of Freedom. And was a specialist on Lord Acton, too, great British historian who had that same thematic flair in the early 20th century. But Rufus and he was a guy that I used to sit down with, 2 or 3 times a year, just like to know what he thought and would seek advice. So not long after I got to Congress, or actually maybe even before I got here, but I'd been elected, we went to have lunch, and I said, hey, I missed... want some advice. What do you think I should be doing up there? And he thought for a minute. He said, right. And he said, first of all, Tom, he said, not many people do anymore. And so it needs to be done. And frankly, do it in hand and not on the computer, because the electronic technology can get corrupted in ways. So do that. He said, you may not be very important when you're in Congress, but you'll seem important when you're gone, because there won't be very many of these things around, and historians will look at them. And I'd kept journals when I worked for Frank Keating as his Secretary of State, and it's pretty cool to have written through the Oklahoma City bombing and have that. So it's literally that day or the next day, and what he was doing in the crisis and what we were seeing around us as that was unfolding. So I've always kind of sort of dabbled with it for certain periods of time. But when I got here, I've been pretty good at it. So there are no breaks. It's been pretty continuous.
Is it a real discipline to write every day?
No, it's kind of fun. And I usually do it about 3 times a week, but you always keep your scheduling card with you, because boom, then you can bring whatever the memory is right back. I don't have a certain time or whatever, but I'm very systematic about keeping it up, because I go back and look at it occasionally. And say, hadn't thought. Matter of fact, I found one line, and Boehner and I went through a good period. Challenging period. When I first got here, I had known him when he was a freshman congressman. I was the executive director of the NRCC, our campaign committee. He was one of the, quote, gang of 7. This was back. We actually came up with the poster over at the NRCC. It was so cool. And so were his 6 guys. And they were rebels back then. I mean, all the leadership hated these guys. And so I knew him very well, and he'd been helpful in my campaign. I was on his committee. We're doing well. But I also am very good friends with Roy Blunt, now Senator Blunt, but then our chief whip. And Roy had been exceptionally good to me. I mean, didn't know me, but he had not only contributed to my campaign, and it was a very competitive race in 2002. He literally sent a busload of volunteers to my district, from his district in Joplin, all the way down to Lawton, Oklahoma, because we had big events going in both places. I had to cover a big parade up in my hometown, and we were stretched, and it was close. And he said, "What can I do to help?" And I said, "You can help us." I've heard about this. It was called a STOMP program, and he said, and then they hit 5,000 doors for me in Lawton, Oklahoma. So we were there. I got here. He made me a whip. I was the first guy in my class to become a deputy whip in my 2nd term. So we're pretty close. Well, they end up running against one another, and I'm on Team Blunt, which put me in the doghouse for about 2 or 3 years with Speaker Boehner. But one night, and this was before this race had occurred, I was sitting at the Capitol Hill Club with some good friends of mine, John Klein, who's still here, Gresh Barrett, who's gone, and Bob Beaupre from Colorado, who's also gone now, and gone in the sense of not here, they're alive. But we were sitting, and frankly, we were having a drink, and Boehner had this big table where he tended out with his kind of group. But, we're all freshmen. We're all on his committee. Bob may not have been, but I know Gresh and John. So he sits down for a second. We're chatting away, And he leaves. Well, in my journal that night, I write, John Boehner came by today, and we were sitting around with these guys and chatting, and, I think he'll run for leadership again someday. And if he does, I'll probably support him. And unless he runs against Roy Blunt, in which case I'm screwed. That's exactly what happened. And I'd totally forgotten that thing. I'm reading this thing. I couldn't believe it. I actually sent it to my friend John Klein, who was on the other side, very close with Speaker Boehner always throughout his career here. But again, it's like most things in life. If Speaker Boehner actually has a wonderful phrase that if you do the right things for the right reasons, the right thing will happen. And so over the course, our relationship changed pretty dramatically. Characters, Boehner defender, close Boehner allies. Boy, whoever's writing this hadn't been around here very long because we went through a couple of difficult years. But that happens in politics, and it wasn't unfair. We just we were on different sides on a lot of things, and it's not smart to be on the wrong side from first the leader and then the speaker, although to be fair, by the time he was speaker, I think we had worked through our issues and worked very hard to find common ground, and so throughout his speakership, I did have a terrific relationship with him.
Tom Cole, how do you get your books? Do you buy them? Do you go to the library?
I actually very seldom go to the library. I mean, I like spending time. I don't want to knock libraries, but I like to own the book. And because I am going to market it. Now, I wouldn't mark up a library book, or if somebody loaned me a book or something like that. I do go to bookstores and just browse like everybody else. I read reviews. I just see something or hear something. There's no particularly systematic way. Or I decide I want to, I think I want to read something on fill in the blank. You just go to the internet, pop up, something that's about this, and there you go. And then I try, if I'm going to have an opportunity to meet an author. The other night at the Library of Congress, we have this presidential series that they're doing, and I didn't have a chance to meet him, but I've been a big admirer of Evan Thomas. He wrote a wonderful book on the Battle of Leyte Gulf many years ago, which a friend of mine got autographed from him, and so I wanted to make sure when I knew that was coming, I read Being Nixon, which I think is one of the best and honestly most sympathetic portraits of Richard Nixon I've ever read. So if you're going to get to hear him, you like to have read it ahead of time. And one of the nice things in this business is you do have those opportunities, perhaps more than a lot of other people do.
So on that night that Evan Thomas was at the Library of Congress, how many members?
Quite a few. They're probably, and very bipartisan, probably at least 50, I would say there. A lot of couples, but it got a big turnout. Again, it's just a terrific book. I was actually sitting next to Ken Calvert, who had, I think he was like chairman of California Youth for Nixon. He knew Nixon very well. And he was telling me about the congratulatory call he got from Nixon the night he won his congressional seat in '92. So, and he said, he was talking about a guy who we both know is a wonderful guy, Ken Kachigan, who's a senior Republican political guy, but was a Nixon speechwriter in California. And he said, I was talking to Ken earlier today, and Ken had been interviewed extensively in the book. He's all through the book. And but I don't think he'd read it yet. So he said, Ken told me, he said, you go listen and you make sure he's fair. And at the end of the evening, Ken concluded, he really was very fair, and evidently he told me, I'm going to call back Kachigan and let him know it's okay. Nixon's got a fair treatment here.
Have you read presidential biographies on most presidents?
I don't know if I'd say quite a few. Quite a few. I mean, they're interesting, and I don't have any. My tastes are about the same as everybody else. I mean, well, maybe not. Nixon is a niche taste, I will grant you. I've read a lot on him, a lot on Eisenhower. Matter of fact, recently, again, you do get some wonderful privileges, when you serve. Susan Eisenhower, I've met on several occasions, and she was kind enough to invite me and my chief of staff, another dear friend, to come out to Gettysburg on a Monday to get a personal tour of the Eisenhower, post-presidential homestead, and it was wonderful. It was one memory after another, because she had lived and went to high school in Gettysburg, lived close, and so here's where I met Khrushchev in the house, and we're talking. I said, well, actually, I actually got close to his plane in '59. She's looking at me. She said, my dad was a master sergeant at McGuire Air Force Base. I'll never forget us going out there to look at the plane that had brought Nikita Khrushchev to the United States, and he was his most senior master sergeant on the base, and so there was a viewing area well back the fence. He could get us pretty close, and my brother and I, and so it was wonderful. She's just, what a treat. And she's, sit there and listen to stories about her grandfather and her grandmother and what they were like, and see the things in the home, but have a personal touch put with him. This was here, this is where I used to sit when my grandmother was doing this, that, or the other. I mean, it was just fabulous.
I don't know if you picked up Peter Carlson of the Washington Post's book about Khrushchev's trip.
No, I've not read that. I should do that, because he was here 2 weeks. I mean, it was a big deal. I'm old enough. I was at the time that was '59, so I was like 10 years old, 9, 10 years old, and I remember it, very, very well, and following it on television and all those sorts of things. But but she's got one story after, and Churchill, Montgomery, coming there and walking the battlefield with her grandfather, and then fun stuff like, here's the barn, here's the horses. I used to run off, and the Secret Service would try to catch me and collar me or follow me. But again, she's a wonderful, wonderful person. But what a treat!
The importance of William Shakespeare to our culture, our politics, in your view?
Oh, pretty profound. I mean, next to the Bible, Shakespeare's probably had more influence on the way we think and the way we talk, and on literature than any other person, and certainly in the history of our language. So, and it's wonderful. Obviously, it's great art. It's great plays, but it's great history too. I mean, it's a reminder. That character and history really matters. That history is not just a matter of demographic forces. That's a big part of it. But individuals count. Individuals matter. Motivation. So, I think I'm no Shakespearean scholar, but anybody that tells you he hasn't been the most influential writer, certainly again in Anglo-American history, so to speak, and probably maybe around the world in some ways, because he is studied in so many languages. I think you got to make him a pretty important guy.
All right, Congressman Cole, let's say after Congress you decide to go back to teaching, and you have to teach a class, and you have to give your students one book to read.
Oh, that's the most unfair question.
It's an obnoxious question, I realize.
All.
I apologize for that.
Well, honestly, it would vary. It would depend on what I was teaching. If I was just giving them a great book and it's something on American history, I mean, I'd probably pick. I love Stephen Ambrose's book. He used to say, I'm told, this was, I think I read someplace, his favorite book to write. And you think of all the, he had a 3-volume Nixon, he had a 2-volume, I think it was 2-volume on Eisenhower. D-Day, Band of Brothers. I mean, this is a great historian. But he wrote a book that's not as widely known as it should be, in my view, and it's called, if I remember the title, it's Crazy Horse and Custer, The Dual Lives of Two American Warriors. I actually found a copy of it when I was going to Little Bighorn Battlefield, when just out on an expedition, and always wanted to see that place, which is haunting. And there's the book. And so I bought the book actually, at the park, little place where you get your trinkets and your books and stuff like that. And it's a fabulous, fabulous book about these two very different warriors with very different traditions. And if you live on the plains like I do, Oklahoma is part of that. As a matter of fact, the first Custer massacre is in Oklahoma, the Battle of Ouachita in western Oklahoma. I worked with Frank Lucas years ago when he was in Congress, and I was Secretary of State. It was in private hands to get it into the national park system, which it is now, thank goodness. But he describes perfectly everything from weather to how this vast tableau of battlefield, how it shaped regionally, obviously shaped the Sioux and the other Great Plains tribes that were involved, but the nature of warfare and the nature of weather and how they interacted. But it's just, it's a great book, and when you're in it that here's a guy that's been pulled into the character of Custer and pulled into the character of Crazy Horse, and it's just. And understands it. He was so good. But but I'd pick this one too, or this one, and it wouldn't even be necessarily a history book. But again, Colleen McCullough's wonderful First Man of Rome series. That book on politics and intrigue in the Roman world. I mean, it's probably better than any history written of the time. And there's some wonderful, wonderful histories. But boy, what a tremendous historical novel, and you learn a lot from it.
Congressman Tom Cole, Republican of Oklahoma, thanks for joining us on BookTV.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.